Good evening, this is Shindo. Tonight I'd like to talk about another problem that is getting very little coverage, and that is the algae plague that is hitting the world. Multiple lakes, multiple waterways across the world are being hit by this toxin of algae. This is an article, science article from the New York Times. As always, I will put a link in the description box. The title of this article is Miles of Algae and the Multitude of Hazards. This is dated July 18th. The stench of decaying algae begins rising from coastal waterways in southeastern Florida early this month, shutting down businesses and beaches during a critical tourism season. Officials arrived, surveyed the toxic muck, and declared states of emergency in 4 counties. Residents shook their heads, then their fists, organized rallies, and haranguing local officials. In truth, there was little they could do. The disaster had engulfed the St. Lucie River and estuary and had been building for weeks. In May, a 33 square mile algal bloom crept over Lake Okeechobee, the vast headwaters of the Everglades. After an unseasonably wet winter, the Army Corps of Engineers was forced to discharge water from the lake to lower water levels, flushing the ooze along the channels to the west until it coagulated along the shores of the famed Treasure Coast. The mess in Florida is only the latest in a string of algal blooms that some experts believe are increasing in frequency and severity. An immense plume of blue-green algae last September covered a 636-mile stretch of the Ohio River. A month earlier, the city of Toledo, Ohio, warned more than 400,000 residents to avoid drinking tap water after toxic algae spread over the intake in Lake Erie. Indeed, the Lake Erie bloom is now an annual event. Almost exactly a year before the Florida bloom, another stretching 7,500 square miles washed ashore in Qingdao, China, a popular beach destination. Government officials called in hundreds of boats and bulldozers to remove it. The green blob appeared again earlier this month. The largest and most dangerous algal bloom ever recorded was ranged from Central California to British Columbia, producing high levels of a toxin that last year closed crab and clam fisheries along the west coast. Quote, the season didn't open for 4.5 months, which meant slip rents went unpaid, house payments went unpaid. Guys were having trouble getting groceries to feed their families, unquote, said Tim Sloan, executive director of the Pacific Coast Federation of Fishermen's Association. Algae is a catch-all term referring to a wide variety of aquatic organisms that generally rely on photosynthesis for energy and reproduction. Blue-green algae are chronobacteria, for instance, while red tide is composed of tiny dinoflagellates. Seaweed is a sophisticated algae, as is kelp. Blooms are natural occurrence, according to Dr. William Copeland, a senior research scientist at San Francisco State University. Native Americans for centuries knew to avoid bioluminescent water. Scientists would later discover that the glow was caused by dinoflagellates that also produce a hazardous neurotoxin. Many algal species produce similar toxins. When vast blooms occur, these poisons may spread through the environment and up the food chain to fish and animals that feed on them. Cyanobacteria produces microcins, for example, which can affect the liver and be deadly to humans. One reason Toledo banned the drinking water. Although they occur naturally, algal blooms are being intensified by human activity in ways that scientists are still trying to quantify. Chief among the culprits, runoff from farms, feedlots, and municipal sewer systems. Quote, the bloom itself is the visual manifestation of nutrient overrichment in the lakes, unquote, said Tim Davis, an ecologist in the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency Great Lakes Environmental Research Laboratories in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Quote, in freshwater systems, both nitrogen and phosphorus are the main nutrients, unquote. In Florida and Great Lakes, nitrogen and phosphorus come mainly from fertilizers used in large farming operations, along with septic tanks, manure, and stormwater. Scientists have been aware that the nutrient problem for decades. It's partly why phosphorus was moved from laundry detergent. The vast algal bloom in the Pacific last year was also fed in part by El Nino, the mass of warm water that forms periodically off the west coast, but longer-term climate change may also be playing a role, some experts say. Warming atmospheric temperatures and wetter weather in some parts of the country increases the nutrient-laden runoffs into streams, lakes, and oceans, and as the ice melts in the Arctic Sea, temperatures are rising, and more sunlight is filtering into the ocean. Quote, some of the features of climate change, such as warmer ocean temperatures and increased light availability through the loss of sea ice in the Arctic, are making conditions more favorable for phytoplankton growth, both toxic and non-toxic algae, in more regions and farther north, unquote. Kathy Lebrofri, a biologist at NOAA Northwest Fisheries Science Center in Seattle, wrote in an email, quote, it's likely the toxic blooms will continue to increase and expand as these features of climate change continue, unquote, she added. Dr. Davis said he also believed that climate change is working against efforts to prevent algal blooms. Quote, I certainly believe as a scientist that climate change will influence the size and intensity of these blooms, he said. Quote, if nothing changes, the increase of rainfall, the increased nutrient loads, warmer water, all this could lead to a larger bloom that lasts longer and more toxic, unquote. Florida's crisis is only the most recent example, Dr. Cochran of San Francisco State University said. Yet no new funds have been appropriated at the federal or state level to study the growth and toxicity in these blooms, despite their increasing impact through the country. In a letter to President Obama on July 12, Florida legislators asked for federal funding to avert further disaster. Back in 2014, Florida voters approved Amendment 1, setting aside an estimated $650 million in the program's first years for the state to buy an agricultural land south of Lake Okeechobee and new pathways for discharge to the Everglades. The hope was the ecosystem would provide a natural filter for algae and other contaminants, as it once did. But in the end, the state decided not to buy the land, instead sparring with Environmental Protection Agency over its efforts to enforce Federal Clean Water Act. Quote, a lot of this has to do with legislation all the way from the watershed down to the lake, Dr. Davis said. Quote, it needs to be a mutual effort on all sides. The more we understand about the blooms, the more we can do to reduce their impact, unquote. So not only are we looking at the toxicity of these blooms, these algae blooms, but also we're looking at the impact of more and more people losing their accessibility to water, which is going to be a major cause of people dying and warring against each other worldwide over the next few years. Again, something else that is going on in the world that is being basically ignored by the media out there, this isn't as interesting as the other things, and they have to sell commercial space on their networks. So I don't have to do that. So I can bring this news to you. Important news, what's going on in the world. I will leave a link to this article, and feel free to comment. Please like, and please subscribe to my channel. This is Shindo. Have a good day.